Hello and welcome to Door 44 Studios. My name is Wendy and I'm the wire weaver behind Door 44. Today we're working on part 2 of the Fleur de Lis earring make-along. These are the earrings that we're making here. In part 1 we started forming the frames for these earrings. We shaped the bulb and the leaves. Today in part 2 we're going to refine the shape of the leaves. We're going to polish the frame to perfection, and then we're going to fold the frame into its final position. And then finally, in part 3 of this series, we'll add the wrapping and the beads. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to mark these leaves to determine exactly where we want to trim them. So you're going to need a fine point permanent marker to do that. Let me just grab my marker. And you want to take each leaf and we're going to trim off this outer corner right here. I'm going to take this off and we're going to get that point we're going to round this off a bit. So do you see how I marked that? Go ahead and mark all 4 of your leaves, something like that. And this is just to give you a clear visual so that when you trim these ends, you kind of know what you want to cut off. So hold on just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and mark these leaves off camera because it's a little bit easier to work that way. And then I'll be right back. Okay, so you can see here that I've marked all 4 of my leaves now. And this just sort of gives you a very clear visual of what your leaves are going to look like once they're trimmed. And this is important to do because you can play around with this and kind of figure out exactly how you want things to look. And this, this just saves you some frustration. You don't want to cut off too much just by trying to eyeball this without doing some sort of marking to give you a clear line of sight on your cuts. So now that we've got these marked, we're going to go ahead and trim off those corners with our wire cutters. So to do this, just open up your bend a little bit, and by that I mean just twist it a little bit so that you get the point of the wire up above these wire shafts here. And that's just so you can get your wire cutters in there to trim. And then you're just going to position your wire cutters right on that mark. And of course, always block the cutoff end with your fingers so that you don't have wire pieces flying across the room. And then just trim that off. Okay. Now you can see there, that's not a perfect line. That's not exactly what we were going for, but we're going to go ahead and clean that up with a file. We'll round off that sort of straight line there. We'll soften the point a little bit so that it's not too sharp. But that's exactly how we're going to begin refining the shape of these leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video for just a moment and trim the rest of my leaves, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so you can see now that I've trimmed all 4 of my leaves, and if you notice, they look a little awkward. The tips are sort of squared off, and that, of course, isn't the look that we're going for. But it's going to be super easy to soften those lines and round off the edges with our needle file. So that's the next thing we're going to do right now. Now, when you're filing, again, you're going to want to go ahead and open these up just a little bit. So just give it a very gentle twist, and that just sort of gets these wires out of your way while you're filing. And then, of course, when you begin filing, it's always important to remember you only want to file in one direction. Your files are designed to be pushed. So metal files, are cut with a certain grain and a certain tooth, and they don't really work sawing back and forth. So always remember to just file in one direction. And we're just going to start to begin gently rounding off these curves. And just, take your time. You can soften that point a little bit, kind of knock off the really sharp bits. And then just carefully soften those straight lines and round off those edges. And that's what's going to give your leaves the nice, soft, pointed lines that we're after. Now this is really difficult to do on camera, so I'm gonna pause the video again, and I'm gonna go ahead and file these off camera and finish refining these shapes, and then I'll be right back. Okay, I've now filed all of my leaves to a point, and you can see here where I've scratched the shafts of these wires a little bit. That's okay. We're going to be wrapping over that part of the wire anyway. But again, that's why you want to go ahead and tip your leaves, the points of your leaves out a little bit while you're filing to kind of help minimize that. So you don't want to damage your wire too badly. Now the nice thing about this, actually, if you give your wire a little bit of tooth, it does help the weaving wire stay in place eventually. So again, we're not going to be too worried about that because we're going to cover those parts of the wire anyway. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start sanding our frames and prepping them for the final assembly. So again, remember when we hammered these frames that we were very careful to select one side of the surface that was going to be sanded. So this is the side you can see again that was up against the bench block. And the reason I can tell that is because it's really flat and there's just no tool marks on this side of the bulb. If I flip that over, you can see there, you can kind of see what looks like creases in the wire. Those are tool marks from the hammer. So this is the front side of this frame. And we're going to start with 800 grit sandpaper. And you can see the sandpaper is already pretty well used. I've been using this to make a number of Fleur de Lis earrings. So I've got quite a bit of, copper already caught up in this paper. But the nice thing about sandpaper is it does last for a really long time. And this is just a quarter sheet of sandpaper. So I fold my sheets in quarters and tear them apart so that I can use just a little bit at a time. And then you can just fold it and, it fits comfortably in your hand while you're working. Now, the thing about sandpaper that's different than files is sandpaper doesn't have a specific grain. So you can sand in different directions and get a nice result, unlike with files where you always want to file in one direction only. So we're just going to go ahead and start sanding this surface, and you can see as I begin that the sandpaper is going to, it's going to touch certain parts of the wire first. So, we just want to get to a point where we don't have any highlights and dark and low lights in this point. We want everything to be looking the same. That's when you know that you've reached a good level of sanding for this particular grit of paper. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep sanding for a bit. And I'm focusing just on the bulb portion. I don't want to sand the wire shafts at all because we're going to end up wrapping those. And, you know, in this case, the wire shafts just below the bulb are going to be hidden. They're going to be the back of your earring frame. So we'll just keep going. And we want to get to a point, again, where the whole surface looks the same. You don't have highlights, you don't have lowlights, you can't see scratches. You just want a clean, even, sort of matte finish is what this 800 grit is going to give you. So let's see where we're at. Now, one of the things I do to kind of see where I'm at is I'll take an old sunshine polishing cloth. This is one that's been pretty well used. I don't use it so much to polish jewelry anymore, but it still works really well for cleaning off sanding dust and kind of giving you an idea of where you're at sanding. Now you can see that most of this frame here looks pretty good, but right here I've still got some high points that I kind of want to smooth off so that all of that is just one nice, pretty, even finish. So again, just keep sanding until you get that cleaned up. And if your sandpaper gets too, clogged, just find another spot that's clean and pick up there. And again, as you're sanding, sort of work on the edges a little bit. We're going to round those edges off just a bit, just to soften them. We don't want, we don't want to take too much wire off, but we do want nice soft edges, which just kind of, gives these earrings a cleaner, prettier line. Okay, that's looking pretty good. We've got a pretty even matte finish across the whole bulb. And that's what we're after. Now you can see a little bit, where I've rounded the corners. You can kind of see how those corners have broken just a bit. They feel nice and soft and round. And that's what we're after. We just want these earrings to feel really soft and organic. They're flowers, so we're going for soft lines here. All right, once you've finished with the 800 grit sandpaper, we're going to move up to 1500 grade, and we're just going to repeat the same process. Now you'll notice as we do this sandpaper is going to soften that matte finish just a bit. It's going to start bringing out a little bit more of a shine to it. So we'll just keep sanding. And this is a messy process, so, your hands are going to get dirty. If you don't want that, if you're somebody who is particular about your manicure and such, you can wear gloves while you do this. Just get yourself some neoprene gloves, something that's thin, that allows you to feel what you're doing, and you can work with those. I have maker's hands. I've never had pretty hands. I've never had pretty nails, and it's because my hands are always doing something. So I'm not too particular about this. I, of course, don't like having dirty hands, so I wash my hands frequently while I'm doing this process. But you can, again, wear gloves if you like. I totally understand not wanting to get your hands full of copper dust. Again, we'll just kind of wipe that off a little bit. Now, you can see that this finish is starting to get just a little bit shinier, and that's what we're after. But there's still, you can see there's quite a few rough spots there. So I'm gonna pause the camera for just a bit and do this, you know, where I can see a little bit better, and I'll be right back when I finish this portion. Okay, just to give you a sense of how the sanding and polishing works with the, you know, the different grits that we're using. So this bulb I've done the 800 grit, and you can see that's a pretty matte finish. It sort of looks like a brushed metal finish, which is a really pretty finish. If you like that look, you can certainly stop here and just go with the 800, and your earrings will have a nice soft matte finish. Here's the 1500 grit, and you can see that it's a little bit shinier. It's not quite as matte. It doesn't have as much of that brushed metal effect. So we're starting to polish these frames up a bit. So now the next step is we're going to go to the 2000 grit. So this is 2000. Again, I'm using just a quarter of a sheet, but I folded so it's easy to hold in my hand. And again, you're just going to start sanding, polishing, and this 2000 grit is going to give you a really nice finish. You can end here. I actually have a 3000 grit sanding board that I'm going to use in the next, you know, as one more step to give it a little bit of higher polish. But this is really going to give you a pretty nice shine just right here. And this process just takes time. This is one of the reasons that a lot of, you know, tutorial writers don't show this process, because it's tedious and time consuming and, you know, quite frankly, a little bit boring to watch on camera. I don't know how excited you are about sitting here watching me sand for an hour, and that's why I'm, you know, sort of cutting out some of the excess tediousness here. Like I say, this is not a highly technical process. It's not a difficult process, but it's one that really will make a huge difference in your jewelry. And this is, you know, again, this is all part of the finishing process. And notice we are nowhere near finished with these earrings yet. So we're not doing this at the end. We're doing it now, before we've got any weaving or beads that we have to worry about scratching while we're sanding. So finishing is actually a misnomer. You know, this is an ongoing refining process that we're doing here. And you do it from beginning to end. You think about it from beginning to end. You're always thinking and planning strategically how you're going to get the best finish on your jewelry. And this is how it's done. So again, I'm going to hop off camera here for just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and finish polishing this so that you can get a sense of, again, the difference between 800 and 1500 grit, what that difference looks like. And I'll be right back. Okay, so here on the right you can see this is the piece that I just finished polishing with 2000 grit paper. And you can see that most of the matte finishes is gone. There's still just a little hint of it on the edges, and that's okay. The camera is magnifying this quite a bit, so to the naked eye this looks much shinier than it does on camera. And again, here's our 800 grit, so you can kind of see the difference there in those finishes. Now you can end with 2000 grit, and you know, again, like I say, this is being magnified quite a bit on camera. With the naked eye, this looks pretty darn shiny. This is, I would say, almost a finished polish right here. But I also go one step further, and I use a 3000 grit sanding stick. Now, I buy these sanding sticks from Rio Grande, and of course they're linked in the resources page, and you'll find a link to that on my blog below. Just look in the description. So I'm using the 3000 grit, which is a super fine abrasive that's going to give these earrings even more of a polish. And again, you know, this board is pretty well used. I'm going to have to replace these pretty soon. I'm going to need to order some more. But yeah, you just go ahead and, again, you know, just give it a good vigorous rub with the stick. And these sticks are like a foam core, so they have a little bit of give, a little bit of flex. They'll kind of get in on the edges and, you know, a little bit there on the inside to give you a really nice, almost a mirror finish. I just love the way these boards work. So you see that, how shiny that is? And again, you can still see a little bit of grain here, but this is, you know, this is magnified quite a bit. My camera's, you know, as it autofocuses, it's really getting in on that magnification. So just keep working that until you're satisfied. And that looks really good. Now again, I'm going to tumble polish these earrings, and that's just going to, you know, add that final bit of polish. But for now, at this point in the construction process, that is looking really good. Now look how shiny those are compared to the matte finish of our 800 grit sandpaper. So, you know, again, this is one of those finishing techniques that a lot of tutorial writers tend to skip over because it is tedious, it is somewhat boring, it's not super technical. This is strictly, you know, some manual labor here, just, you know, working on this by hand until you get that nice finish. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to polish this bulb next, and then we'll get back to working on our leaves again. I'll be right back with a finished bulb. Okay, here we are. Both of our bulbs have been polished to a high shine. We've got some fingerprints on there. Again, a well-used sunshine cloth that, you know, isn't working very well for polishing jewelry anymore still works really well for cleaning off your jewelry while you're doing these finishing processes. Now, one thing to notice, as you're handling your wire and as you're doing the sanding, you're probably going to rub off your marks for your fold. So I went ahead and added those marks back in because they were almost completely gone. You want to make sure you keep those marks there because that's going to be really important to maintaining the symmetry on these earrings when you do that final fold. So there we are. Our bulbs are nice and shiny, have a nice pretty high polish finish, and you can see the edges are soft and smooth. Now we're going to flip these over and we're going to do the same thing on the leaves. Now again, the back of your bulb is the front of your leaves because we're going to fold this frame. So this is the unfinished side. You can see that there's tool marks on this side. This is not the shiny, pretty finish. So we're just going to flip both of those over, and we're going to repeat that whole sanding process, 800, 1500, 2000 grit on the leaves. And when you're working on the leaves, you want to go ahead and find my 800 grit sandpaper here. You want to go ahead and make sure you work on the tips of those leaves as well. We want to soften those edges, make sure there's no sharp points that are going to poke anybody, you know, get caught in hair. We just want these to be nice, smooth, soft lines. So again, work on those tips and keep sanding, get that nice, even matte finish. And then go ahead and move up to 1500, 2000, and if you like, 3000 grit. So, you know, a little bit of a boring process here, but it makes such a big difference in your finished jewelry. So, you know, I don't particularly enjoy this part of the process, but it makes such a big difference that I just can't justify not doing it. It's really important to, you know, give your jewelry as professional a finish as you can. And as you can see, you don't need fancy tools to do that. You don't need an expensive rotary tool. Now, people frequently ask me why I don't use a rotary tool, and the reason is because I have very limited space, and my studio is actually in the bedroom that I share with my husband. So I really try to minimize just the clutter that I have on my bench, and also rotary tools, they work wonderfully, and you'll get a much nicer finish much faster using a rotary tool. So if you have the space and you have a dedicated studio space, I would recommend investing one. And as soon as I do have a dedicated studio space, I will definitely buy a rotary tool. But for now, I just don't want all the clutter in our bedroom, and I don't want all the dirt and grime that comes with rotary tools. They create a lot of dust. You really need to have great ventilation in a studio space where you're using a rotary tool. You need to, again, consider wearing protective equipment, just to sort of protect yourself from the flying particles that come from those devices. Sandpaper, it's going to create some dust, but it's nowhere near as dirty as a rotary tool. So that's why I stick to sandpaper. I try to keep things super simple because, we're apartment dwellers. I have a very small space. Once I have a dedicated studio, and I do expect to have one someday, I will invest in more tools, and I'll be sharing those techniques as well. But until then, we're just going to keep it simple. So again, just keep sanding, polishing, smoothing, get all those lines nice and soft. Soften your edges, soften the points of your leaves. And then you can repeat that on the other leaf. And again, I'm using 800 grit paper at this point. And there we go. We have a pretty good matte finish. You can see there's a little bit of a high spot there, and that's because when I was filing, I left a little bit of a lip there on the very point of that leaf. So we're just going to soften that, break that sharp edge there, take that down, and there you go. That high point is gone, and I've now got a nice even matte finish across the entire shape of the leaf. Now if you want, you can come back in here and do a little bit more filing, or you can just soften those edges a bit more, soften those curves using your 800 grit sandpaper. And you can also use, a rougher grit sandpaper to do that. See, I still have just a bit of a point there. Can you see there where that edge sort of, breaks a little bit off of a corner? There's not a nice round edge there. So I can take my 400 grit sanding stick, which is the red one. And again, you can see this is very well used. I do need to I do need to get some more sanding sticks. And I can just soften that corner there. Take that down. And if it gets to be too much to do with a sanding stick, you can always go back to your files, but I think we're just gonna do a bit of sanding here to break that little corner. And that looks better. See now how that point is gone. And then again, just get in there with your 800 grit sandpaper and get those edges nice and smooth and round. Take that point down and get in there on the point and break that with your sandpaper. We just want soft lines here. There, that's looking a lot better. All right, we're going to move on to our 1500 grit paper. And next level of sanding. There we go. See there? We're starting to bring back the shine, getting rid of that matte finish. And right there on the point, we've got just a little bit of a high spot. Again, we can get in there, break that edge, soften it up. And that's looking better. Clear away some of that dust. Okay, there we go. And on to the 2000. Find a nice clean section of your sandpaper. And get in there and polish with the 2000 grit. And just, press with your finger, and that'll help you get the edges. The sandpaper is pretty flexible, and it'll sort of get down those inside edges if you just press hard enough with your finger. And let's see here if you can see the difference there between the... Yep, we've got to do a little bit more sanding here. So I'm gonna pop off camera here. I'm gonna finish this hand sanding, and I'll be right back to take a look at the difference. Okay, so here on the left I use the 2000 grit, and this is still the 1500 grit. You can see there's not a huge difference. So we went from 800 to 1500, and that was quite a difference. 1500 to 2000 is less of a difference, but you can see that the side I did with the 2000 grit sandpaper is quite a bit smoother and shinier. So now we're just going to go ahead and finish this leaf with the 2000 grit, and you can protect the part that you've already sanded with your thumb, and just get in there and give that final leaf a good sanding. Now, of course, I'm sanding my thumbnail with this while I'm doing this. So again, if you're very concerned about your nails, you have a nice manicure, I totally understand wanting to protect that. Just wear some gloves. Just some basic neoprene gloves that you can find in your hardware store, cleaning section of the grocery store. You want something thin so that you can feel what you're doing. You don't want to wear like thick dishwashing gloves. Those are going to be much too thick for this process. But you can protect your nails and still get a nice professional finish on your jewelry. Okay, so there we are. We've got pretty good polish there. And I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my 3000 grit polishing board and just give it a good vigorous rub. And look at that difference. See that? Repeat on the other side. And there we go. Looking pretty good. So we've got a nice mirror finish on this side, and a nice mirror finish on this side. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish polishing my other frame, and I'll be right back and we'll finish this fold. Okay, this is my second earring frame that I'm working on here, and I've already done the 800 grit sanding, so you can see that matte finish there, sort of the brushed metal look. But notice here that, you know, these leaves still have a little bit of a corner as well. Both of them have just a little bit of a point that I want to go ahead and knock off. So again, I'm using my 400 grit sanding stick. So if you've noticed on sanding paper, the smaller the number, the coarser the grit. So 400 grit is much more coarse and more of a true sandpaper than 2000 grit or the 3000 grit, which is going to give you, you know, it's such a fine adhesive that it's going to give you a polished finish rather than sanded finish. So again, I'm just going to knock those corners down a little bit, just, you know, soften the curves, round them off, and kind of break that edge a little bit so we get nice, soft, rounded curves. We want these to look, you know, like they just sort of flow. We don't want any harsh lines in these leaves. That looks much better. I'll do the same thing on this side. We're just going to soften that curve. And I'm just moving the frame across the sanding board, you know, twisting my wrist and kind of moving it in that nice, soft, rounded motion. This is, you know, this is the I'm moving in the direction that I want the line to form. So I'm forming an arc here as I move across the sanding board. And there we go. That looks quite a bit better. See how soft that curve is now? All right, so I can just go ahead and finish touching this up with my 800 grit sandpaper. Get everything nice and matte, get that pretty brushed look. And again, you can leave your earrings with this look. If you like a matte finish, then you can leave off with the 800 grit, and your earrings will have that nice soft matte glow rather than a, you know, mirror finish shine. And there we go. These leaves are looking pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish polishing this piece, and then we're going to come back and we're going to complete that fold. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to fold these frames into their final position. And you can see that this frame here, we have the unfinished side of the bulb and the finished side of the leaves facing. This is the side where our line is marked. Now, we're always going to want to fold the unfinished side of the leaves toward the finished side of the bulb. Regardless of which side that your line is on, just keep that in mind. This is the key to making sure you get these folded properly and you get all the right faces, the finished faces facing forward. So unfinished side of the leaves toward the finished side of the bulb. That's the trick. So to do this, we're just going to put our flat nose pliers right on that mark. We'll just center that mark right there. Okay, so we've got our mark centered right in the middle of our jaws. And remember, we're going unfinished side of the leaves, which is this back side, toward the finished side of the bulb, which is this back side. So I'm just going to push these leaves down and around. Let's see, jaws slipping off here. And just push them all the way around. And they should end up right under that bulb, which is what we want. So there you go. You can see we have both of our finished sides facing forward. Flip this over and you can see the unfinished sides in the back. Okay, and we'll just go ahead and repeat that on our other frame. And again, we're gonna take these unfinished sides of the leaves and we're gonna bend them toward the finished side of the bulb. So in this case, I'm gonna go the other direction. There's all of my unfinished sides. Flip it over and there's my finished sides. All right. So the next thing you're going to do, you'll get your stepped bail making pliers. And we're going to use the 3mm step, which is the second largest one. So it's 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9. And I'm just going to slip that 2mm step right in between the two folded pieces and just grab firmly there at the tip of that fold and try not to slip off like I just did, and just roll that end slightly around the 3mm step. Flip your frame over, repeat, and we're just creating a little bit of a shoulder there. We want these curves to slip right over the shoulder of the bead once we're done. All right, and then from there, you just want to flare your leaves out just a little bit. We're just going to create a little bit of a V. And we just want just enough of a gap that we can slip our accent bead down in that V. And that looks pretty good. You can play around with this a little bit, kind of soften the lines a bit, get your leaves exactly where you want them. But remember, once we add the beads, we're going to do some hand sculpting too to sort of finalize the position of everything. But that's looking pretty good. So again, on your second frame, slip that 2mm step down between the two folds, and we're going to bend with the 3mm step. Just a little bit. Just opening that up, creating a shoulder for the briolet to slip up into. And there we go. And then again, I'm going to flare these leaves out just a bit. And that's it. So your frames are complete. That flipped over. So there's your frames. And you can see they look a little bit rough at this point. Once we add the wrapping and the beads and we sculpt them into their final position, they're going to look a lot cleaner. So there you go. That concludes part 2 of this tutorial I'll be back again next week for part 3, and we'll add the beads, add the wrapping, and add our ear wires, and these earrings will be ready to wear. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial today. I'll see you next week.